You don't spend 15 years as a heavy diesel mechanic in Roswell, New Mexico, without learning to read the language of machinery. Metal speaks, it protests under stress, it groans when fatigued, and it sings a very specific harmonic tune when it's running hot across the high desert. But what woke me up at 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday wasn't a failing alternator or a blown head gasket from the interstate. It was an invasive, low-frequency resonance that vibrated right through the concrete slab of my workshop on the outskirts of town, rattling the craftsman wrenches on my pegboard. It was an oppressive, industrial thrumming, a mechanical vibration that felt completely unnatural, echoing across the barren flats. This wasn't just a noise, it was an active acoustic pressure, an ominous desert hum that seemed to distort the very air around my property. I threw on my flannel, grabbed my heavy-duty maglite, and stepped out into the dry, biting night air. The sky over Chaves County was pitch black, stripped of clouds, but the usual canopy of stars felt strangely obscured, swallowed by a heavy, static-charged atmosphere. "Wyatt, is that you out there?" The voice belonged to my neighbor, Hank Miller, an old retired rancher who lived a quarter-mile up the dirt road. He was standing near his fence line, holding a shotgun, his face looking pale under the moonlight. "Yeah, Hank, it's me," I called back, my voice sounding flat, completely absorbed by the ambient vibration. "You hearing it?" "Hearing it? Son, it's rattling the fillings right out of my teeth," Hank said, stepping closer to the road. His face looked pale under the moonlight. "Sounds like a massive generator, but there ain't no drilling rigs permitted out this way. It's coming from the ridge near the old arroyo." He was right. The frequency was shifting, dropping into a sub-audible register that I could feel directly in my chest cavity, a rhythmic, mechanical pulsing that made my skin prickle with an instinctual evolutionary dread. It felt like standing too close to a massive, idling turbine, yet the desert was completely dead. No wind, no nocturnal insects, no highway traffic, just that suffocating, explicit mechanical drone. Driven by a restless curiosity I couldn't quite contain, I walked past Hank's perimeter, tracking the acoustic trajectory toward the ridge. My boots crunched loudly on the caliche soil. "Wyatt, I wouldn't be messing around out there," Hank warned, his voice fading as I moved down into the ravine. The deeper I went into the arroyo, the more the atmospheric pressure increased, mimicking the sensation of a rapid, deep-sea descent. My ears popped violently. The beam of my flashlight began to flicker, the LED element yellowing and losing intensity, as if the batteries were being actively drained by an external electromagnetic draw. Then the smell hit me. It wasn't the metallic tang of ozone or the sulfur of a gas leak. It was an explicit chemical stench of copper and organic decay, an offensive combination that made my stomach turn. I rounded the bend of the wash, and the hum abruptly ceased. The absolute vacuum of sound was deafening. In that absolute silence, a localized, blinding pillar of incandescent white light erupted from the sky, pinning me to the desert floor. There was no descent, no visible craft, just an overwhelming, absolute illumination that stripped away all shadows. The sheer physical force of the light hit me like a solid object, pinning my limbs, rendering my neuromuscular system entirely responsive. I tried to scream for Hank, but my vocal cords were completely paralyzed. My field of vision began to pixelate, blurring into a geometric array of sterile, silver-gray surfaces. The oppressive heat of the New Mexican desert vanished, replaced instantly by an artificial sub-zero chill that smelled heavily of antiseptic and wet iron. I wasn't on the dirt anymore. I could feel a seamless metallic plane beneath my back. Above me, shapes began to coalesce out of the glare, elongated, asymmetric silhouettes that defied human anatomy, moving with a fluid, terrifying efficiency. I felt a sharp, localized pressure behind my left ear, a cold, probing sensation that bypassed my skin and pressed directly into the bone. Then the world snapped back. I gasped, collapsing forward onto my hands and knees into the cold desert dirt. My flashlight lay a few feet away, its casing split open, the battery cells completely ruptured and leaking acid. The air was warm again, the silence was gone, replaced by the distant, mundane sound of a semi-truck braking on Route 285. I stumbled back toward the road, my head throbbing with a vicious migraine-level intensity. Hank's porch light was still on, but as I approached his house, I noticed the sky in the east was already turning a pale, bruised violet. I pulled my phone from my pocket to check the time. The digital display blinked erratically, the internal clock resetting itself continuously. When I finally managed to look at my watch, the realization hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't 2:30 a.m. anymore, it was 6:12 a.m. 4 hours of my life had been cleanly excised, leaving behind nothing but a metallic taste on my tongue and a small, perfectly circular puncture mark bleeding sluggishly behind my left ear.
After I retired to a quiet brick colonial townhouse in Arlington, Virginia, I kept my mouth shut about most of what I saw during the old Project Blue Book days. But 3 weeks ago, while smoking a cigar on my back patio, I logged an unidentifiable aerial phenomenon crossing the Potomac airspace. A silent, non-ballistic transit that defied standard aerodynamics. Foolishly, I utilized an old secure military channel to report the tracking coordinates to an active duty colleague, Bradley Vance. I thought my legacy clearance would protect me, but the sudden arrival of the men in black on my doorstep proved that some entities operate entirely outside the standard chain of command. It happened on a damp, foggy Thursday evening. The street lamps along the block were flickering, choked by a heavy mist rolling off the river. I was pouring a glass of bourbon when the doorbell rang. It wasn't a normal, impatient ring. It was a single, flat, perfectly timed chime that echoed coldly through the hallway. When I opened the door, the ambient temperature in the entryway dropped instantly, the air turning thin and smelling faintly of burnt copper and stale ozone. 2 men stood on my porch. They wore identical, immaculately tailored black suits, crisp white shirts, and narrow black ties. Their white skin had a sickening, waxy sheen, looking completely devoid of blood flow. But it was their faces that made my stomach drop into a hollow void of instinctual dread. They possessed absolutely no eyebrows, no eyelashes, and their unblinking, glassy eyes remained perfectly static, fixed on me with a dead, predatory intensity. "Mr. Arthur Pendergast," the one on the left said. His voice was an unnatural, synthesized monotone, completely lacking any human cadence or inflection. "We require an administrative debriefing regarding your recent unauthorized transmission." "Who is asking?" I demanded, leaning into my old military authority, though my hand was trembling slightly against the doorframe. The second man smoothly reached into his breast pocket and produced a small leather-bound identification card. He held it up to the porch light. The card was entirely blank, a seamless, smooth piece of white plastic that seemed to actively absorb the pale light around it. "Our authorization supersedes your previous security classification, Arthur," the second one stated, his jaw moving with a strange mechanical stiffness. "May we cross the threshold?" Before I could answer, a profound, suffocating pressure filled the room, mimicking the physical sensation of rapid barometric decompression. My ears popped violently. A wave of intense vertigo washed over me, and without a conscious decision, I stepped aside, my neuromuscular system feeling sluggish and unresponsive under their gaze. They glided past me into the living room, their heavy black leather shoes making absolutely no sound on my polished hardwood floors. They did not sit. They stood perfectly rigid in the center of the room, side by side, like twin statues carved from obsidian. "The transmission you initiated with Bradley Vance on April 14th contained sensitive data parameters. The aerial trajectory you documented was a systemic error, an atmospheric mirage. You will correct your personal logs." I know the difference between a weather inversion and a solid craft cutting through restricted airspace, I argued, my voice sounding weak, swallowed entirely by the oppressive atmosphere they brought with them. The second man stepped closer. The explicit odor of decaying organic material mixed with industrial antiseptic suddenly rolled off him. Up close, I could see that his lips were painted a crude artificial red to mimic blood flow, but the skin underneath remained completely translucent. "Your specialized knowledge is a depreciating asset, Mr. Pendergast. Memory is a highly volatile storage medium. It can be easily corrupted, degaussed, or entirely erased. We highly recommend a permanent system restore regarding the events of that night." The air became so heavy I could barely draw breath into my lungs. The digital clock on my microwave began to spin backward at an impossible speed, the numbers blurring into a frantic smear of green light. My television clicked on by itself, displaying nothing but a violent, roaring wall of white static that seemed to pulse in synchronicity with my own accelerating heartbeat. "We are deleting the file," the first man said, reaching out with a long, pale hand. His fingers were unnaturally elongated, lacking distinct knuckles. He didn't touch me, but as his hand hovered inches from my face, a searing, white-hot, localized pain spiked behind my eyes, as if a needle were pressing directly into my cerebral cortex. I gasped, dropping to my knees on the rug, my vision fracturing into a kaleidoscope of sterile, gray geometric patterns. When I finally opened my eyes, the living room was completely dark and silent. The television was off. The microwave clock read 3:14 a.m. I staggered to my feet, my muscles aching with a profound, deep-seated fatigue. The house was empty, but the faint, lingering scent of scorched copper remained in the air. I stumbled over to my desk to check my secure terminal, but the motherboard was completely fried, the plastic casing melted from an intense, localized electromagnetic impulse. The data was gone, and as I reached up to wipe the cold sweat from my forehead, my fingers brushed against a small, perfectly circular patch of hairless, blistered skin right above my missing eyebrows.
A midnight shift at the Point Loma Oceanographic Station is usually defined by the predictable, rhythmic hum of server racks and the steady baseline of the Pacific tide. But when a massive, anomalous UAP track materialized on my deep-water telemetry arrays, that familiar coastal tranquility vanished, replaced by a suffocating sense of isolation. I was monitoring the hydrophone feeds from the southern edge of the San Clemente Basin when the tracking software triggered a cascading system alarm. This wasn't a standard mechanical malfunction or a wayward naval vessel. It was a transmedium anomaly, a solid object moving beneath the surface at a velocity that completely defied the physical laws of hydrodynamic drag. The air inside the control room turned instantly cold and oppressive, the atmosphere thickening with static. "Maya, tell me you're seeing this thermal plume on the secondary array," called out my supervisor, Thomas Keller, his pale face illuminated by the harsh amber glow of my primary terminal. "The Doppler radar is logging 0 atmospheric displacement, but the sonar has a hard return at 90 knots. That's physically impossible for any known submarine hull." "It's accelerating, Thomas," I said, my fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard as I adjusted the acoustic filters. "Look at the cavitation profile. There isn't one. It's moving through the water column without creating a wake, as if it's actively warping the displacement vector around itself." We watched the digital interface in disbelief as the track maintained a localized, frictionless transit, heading straight toward the surface. It didn't slow down as it approached the boundary layer. Driven by a sudden, anxious impulse, I grabbed my ruggedized night vision optics and stepped out onto the exterior observation catwalk overlooking the Black Pacific. The marine layer was dense, dropping a heavy, damp fog over the coastline that smelled strongly of kelp, salt, and an unnatural, explicit odor of scorched electrical insulation. The air pressure felt heavy and suffocating. "Maya, get back inside!" Thomas shouted through the open, heavy steel door, his voice strained with a sudden, instinctual panic. "The telemetry is spiting. The electromagnetic interference is blowing out our localized sensors." Before I could turn around, the dark horizon erupted. A few miles out, the ocean's surface didn't splash, it seemed to part symmetrically as an oblong, matte black metallic shape breached the water column. The object was completely seamless, lacking any visible propulsion systems, control surfaces, or exhaust ports. The transition from hydrodynamic to aerodynamic flight was instantaneous. It broke the surface at an estimated Mach 4, yet there was no sonic boom, no concussive shockwave, and no displaced water. There was only a profound, ominous silence that seemed to swallow the entire coastline. The object hovered completely stationary for a fraction of a second, silhouetted against the dark sky like a jagged tear in reality. Then the localized atmosphere began to distort. A freezing, artificial downdraft swept over the catwalk, making my teeth chatter instantly as the temperature plummeted. My night vision goggles violently strobed, the digital phosphor display burning out into a blinding lime green smear of static before dying completely. "Thomas, it's right above the basin," I yelled, dropping the useless optics. The UAPs suddenly executed an instantaneous right-angled turn, violating every known law of inertia. It shot straight down, plunging back into the dark ocean with the exact same frictionless efficiency. The moment it submerged, a massive, low-frequency acoustic vibration rattled the metal grates of the catwalk beneath my boots, vibrating directly through my skeletal system. When I stumbled back into the control annex, the atmosphere was thick with the stench of fried circuits. Every single monitor had gone completely dark, their internal motherboards thoroughly cooked by a massive, localized electromagnetic pulse. Thomas was standing frozen in the center of the room, staring at a small backup analog dial that was still spinning erratically. "The hydrophones are completely dead, Maya," Thomas whispered, his voice trembling as he wiped a sheen of cold sweat from his forehead. "The entire basin array just melted." We stood there in the dark, listening to the distant, mundane sound of the tide crashing against the rocks below. The data was completely erased, but as I reached up to steady myself against the console, I noticed my smartwatch had frozen entirely, its digital interface permanently locked at 02:14 a.m. The anomalous drone was gone back into the deep, leaving behind nothing but a lingering metallic taste on my tongue and a profound, terrifying certainty that our oceans are no longer entirely our own.
Isolation is a commodity you expect when you operate a high-frequency listening post on the edge of the Nevada test range. But when my modified Icon transceiver intercepted a cascading electromagnetic anomaly just outside Rachel, Nevada, that quiet desert solitude transformed into an oppressive psychological trap. I was tuning through the shortwave spectrum, monitoring the structural baselines of the upper atmospheric bands, when a rogue signal overrode my squelch settings. This wasn't the standard data packet or a stray military transmission from the nearby Groom Lake corridors. It was an explicit, highly structured broadcast cutting through the cosmic static. A terrifying, rhythmic audio stream that possessed the distinct, terrifying cadence of an extraterrestrial transmission masking itself as synchronized human vocalizations. The air inside my cramped trailer grew instantly heavy, the scent of ozone and overheated copper wiring spiking as the transceiver's signal-to-noise ratio maxed out into the red. "Victor, tell me you're logging this spike on the spectrum analyzer," muttered my colleague Garrett Hayes, stepping into the back alcove with a lukewarm cup of black coffee. He leaned over my shoulder, his pale face illuminated by the green, frantic dancing of the oscilloscope grid. "The carrier wave is holding a perfectly stable amplitude at 1420 megahertz. That's the hydrogen line, Victor. No domestic aircraft or military radar operates on that bandwidth without causing a federal incident." "It's not military, Garrett," I said, my fingers adjusting the fine-tuning dial of the BFO to filter out the heterodyne whistle. "Look at the phase modulation. It's a multi-layered acoustic array. It's coming from an orbital trajectory that matches 0 cataloged satellites." As I pushed the audio output through the heavy-duty monitoring speakers, the static dropped away entirely. What filled the small room wasn't the cold mathematical beep of telemetry. It was an explicit, multi-tonal harmony, a complex, layered resonance that sounded exactly like hundreds of human voices singing a liturgical, mournful chorus. But there were no words, no linguistic syntax, and no pauses for breath. It was a fluid, unbroken vocal wall that vibrated directly through the structural framing of the desk, echoing with a hollow, synthetic depth that made the hair on my arms stand up. Driven by an urgent, claustrophobic impulse to escape the suffocating weight of the audio, I grabbed my handheld frequency counter and stepped outside into the dry, freezing desert night. The sky over Lincoln County was a sharp, unclouded sheet of black velvet, but the stars felt strangely distant and cold. The expansive landscape was dead silent, yet the atmosphere felt highly pressurized, mimicking the heavy electric tension that precedes a severe lightning strike. "Victor, get back in here! The signal tracking is shifting!" yelled Garrett through the screened door, his voice strained with a sudden, instinctual panic. "The Doppler shift is reversing. The source isn't passing over us anymore. It's actively decelerating." Before I could turn back towards the trailer, a localized, profound silence fell over the desert sagebrush. The natural wind stopped entirely. Looking up toward the northern ridge of Sector 4, I watched the stars begin to violently distort, their light bending and refracting around an invisible, localized gravitational mass. There was no visible metallic hull, no flashing strobe lights, no exhaust trails. Instead, a massive geometric tear of absolute matte black darkness blotted out the constellations, hovering completely stationary against the night sky. The temperature plummeted instantly, turning my breath into a thick, white cloud. My handheld frequency scanner strobed erratically, its liquid crystal display burning out into a solid black bar before the internal lithium battery ruptured with a soft, hissing pop. "Victor, it's hovering," I whispered into the dead air, my vocal cords tightening under a sudden wave of nausea. From the dark mass above the ridge, a singular, high-intensity pulse of localized radio frequency energy swept across the valley. It didn't make a sound in the open air, but the human chorus from the transceiver inside the trailer suddenly erupted into a deafening, chaotic crescendo that bypassed my ears entirely, vibrating directly inside my cerebral cortex. The voices weren't singing anymore. They were screaming in a perfect, horrifying unison, an explicit wave of mental agony that brought me instantly to my knees on the gravel. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the neural override was absolute. My field of vision pixelated, dissolving into a blinding grid of white-hot static and cold alien geometry. When the atmospheric pressure finally broke, I collapsed forward onto the desert floor, gasping for air as the warm Nevada wind returned. The black void above the ridge was gone. I scrambled back inside the trailer to find Garrett slumped over the main console, a thin trickle of blood weeping from his left nostril. Every single vacuum tube in my vintage receiver had shattered symmetrically, the glass shards littering the workbench like melted ice. "The clock, Victor," whispered Garrett hoarsely, his face entirely bloodless as he pointed a trembling finger toward the wall. The digital network display was frozen solid at 03:14 a.m. A quick glance at my analog wristwatch confirmed that 3 hours of our lives had been cleanly excised from the timeline. The extraterrestrial signal had gone silent, leaving behind a permanent low-frequency ringing in our ears and a terrifying certainty that whatever was singing from Sector 4
had successfully completed its download.
A persistent throbbing ache behind my left knee was what initially disrupted my morning routine in Boulder, Colorado. As a clinical histotechnologist, my life is governed by structural symmetry, cellular benchmarks, and anatomical anomalies. So when I pulled back my sweatpants to inspect the area, my professional detachment completely evaporated. There, sliced cleanly through the epidermis and superficial fascia, was a flawless 3-centimeter linear incision. It wasn't jagged like a household laceration. It was a microscopic masterpiece of surgical closure, completely devoid of erythema, bruising, or localized inflammation. The tissue edges were perfectly opposed, yet I had absolutely no recollection of sustaining an injury. It was an impossible wound, and the moment my fingers touched the cold skin surrounding it, a cascade of dormant, explicit images flooded my consciousness, unraveling a terrifying sequence of implanted memories that pointed directly to an encounter with grey aliens. The atmospheric pressure inside my sunlit suburban home suddenly felt suffocatingly heavy, as if the oxygen had been systematically stripped from the room. I tried to convince myself it was just a strange manifestation of altitude sickness, but the phantom smell of industrial formaldehyde and scorched copper began to lace the air. "Lydia, you've been staring at that wall for 10 minutes, my husband Warren Foster noted as he stepped into the kitchen holding his travel mug. He glanced down at my exposed leg, his brow furrowing as he caught sight of the mark. "Where did you get that? Did you catch yourself on the fence during your run yesterday near Chautauqua Park?" "No, Warren," I whispered, my voice sounding flat, entirely absorbed by an invasive low-frequency buzzing that had suddenly started ringing inside my cranium. "This is a subcuticular closure. There are no suture tracks, no surgical staples, no cellular exudate. It's a closed incision, but the underlying neuromuscular tissue feels completely violated." "Let me take a closer look," he said, setting his mug down on the counter and kneeling beside my chair. He reached out to palpate the perimeter of the wound, his hands warm against my freezing skin. "It looks like an outpatient biopsy site, but we haven't been near the hospital since your dental work last winter." The moment his thumb applied slight diagnostic pressure to the lateral edge of the incision, a profound localized neurological spike shattered my equilibrium. The bright pine-shaded landscape of Boulder outside the window dissolved into a terrifying monochromatic void. The warmth of the kitchen was instantly replaced by an artificial sub-zero chill that numbed my extremities. I wasn't sitting in my chair anymore. I was restrained, stripped entirely naked, and pinned flat against a seamless matte metal examination table that actively vibrated against my spine. The room was illuminated by a cold, diffused luminescence that possessed no visible source, casting no shadows. Above me, moving with a synchronized mechanical efficiency that bypassed all human kinetics, were 3 distinct silhouettes. They were diminutive, completely hairless entities with oversized asymmetrical craniums that tapered sharply to fragile, chinless jaws. Their skin was a dull, waxy tone of liquid gray, completely lacking any visible dermal pores or vascular structures. But it was their eyes that anchored me to the metal table in absolute evolutionary dread. Massive, unblinking orbs of solid, glossy obsidian that seemed to actively project a powerful sedative frequency straight into my cerebral cortex. I tried to initiate a vocal cry, to scream for Warren, but my vocal cords were entirely paralyzed by a localized anesthetic barrier. One of the grey entities leaned closer, its long, spindly upper extremity terminating in 4 jointless, elongated digits.
It held a slender metallic instrument that emitted no sound but pulsed with a subtle violet thermal signature. I felt the explicit sensation of that freezing tool driving deep through my dermal layers, bypassing the sensory nerves to deposit something microscopic and metallic directly against the bone structure of my leg. "Lydia, breathe, honey, just breathe." Warren's voice broke through the paralysis like a concussive shockwave. I gasped violently, collapsing forward onto the kitchen tiles, my chest heaving as my lungs struggled to process the warm, oxygen-rich air of the room. My core body temperature had plummeted, and a violent, involuntary shivering racked my entire skeletal system. "You went completely catatonic on me," Warren stammered, his face pale as he gripped my shoulders, his hands trembling. "Your eyes, your pupils were completely dilated, and you weren't responding to any external stimuli." I looked down at my knee. The perfect 3-centimeter incision was still there, but a tiny dark bead of serisanguinous fluid was now weeping from the center of the track. The digital clock on the microwave was cycling erratically, its LED display blinking continuously in an unreadable sequence. The morning sun was still shining through the window, but the familiar world felt entirely fragile now, a superficial veneer masking a profound, ominous reality. The memories hadn't been forgotten, they had been surgically suppressed, and as I stared at the blood on my finger, I knew the anomalous implant in my leg was already broadcasting my coordinates back to the dark sky.